A serious critique of the cooperative movement was levelled by Olive Johnson of the Socialist Labour Party in her 1924 tract, The Cooperative Movement, An Infantile Disorder and an Old Age Disease. Johnson prefaced her remarks with a quote from Marx from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. The more important leaders of the proletariat in its councils and the press fall one after another victims of the courts, and ever more questionable figures step to the front. It partly throws itself upon doctrinaire experiments, cooperative banking and labor exchange schemes. In other words, it goes into movements in which it gives up the task of revolutionizing the old world with its own large collective weapons, and on the contrary, seeks to bring about its emancipation behind the back of society in private ways, within the narrow bounds of its own class conditions, and, consequently, inevitably fails. Johnson discusses both consumer co-ops and producer co-ops, the latter being by far the more interesting. She criticized producer co-ops in the following manner. A group of workers perceive that they are robbed by their employers out of a portion of the wealth they produce. They desire to free themselves from this robbery by self-employment, but they have progressed so far as to recognize that the day of individual self-employment passed with the introduction of machine production. Cooperative labor is the order of the day. So this group of workers conceive that by putting their savings together, they can purchase the machines they know so well how to operate, and by employing themselves collectively, they can, or ought to, get the profit themselves, which the capitalist employers now squeeze out of them. In other words, they scent the possibility of harvesting the full fruit of their labor, which undoubtedly they have heard some socialist agitator talk about. And they, like shrewd and practical men that they imagine themselves to be, mean to get the full product without any of that socialist nonsense of revolution and upsetting everything. So they launch their little venture of practical socialism. The only, and the great trouble with this kind of socialism is that its very heartbeats depend on competition. Successful competition in the market, with the goods produced by the exploiters of labor, the gigantic corporations and trusts. Though it's true that the cooperative movement can't escape competition, and the situation hasn't changed for the better in the last 100 years, still, even at this late stage, small businesses account for about 46% of jobs in the private sector, and the internet has made it possible to generate income online. Of course, many small businesses exploit workers intensely, and many workers have multiple jobs just to survive. In the final analysis, there are a relatively small number of niches that would be appropriate for revolutionary cooperativism to enter. The strategy manifest in revolutionary cooperativism, however, isn't to compete capitalism out of existence, but rather to build a socialist industrial union movement and to rescue and alleviate the burdens of ourselves and our working class brothers and sisters, with a certain amount of our production sold on the market and another part destined for direct consumption in the form of free access. This will be discussed in depth in part 3 of this series. The revolutionary cooperative movement proclaims a revolutionary goal which puts it in resonance with the admonition of Marx not to give up the task of revolutionizing the old world. Why is it necessary to create a movement of revolutionary cooperatives and socialist communities? Why not proceed directly to the revolution? There are numerous reasons, the most obvious being that there is insufficient consciousness on the part of the working class. The approach that Johnson advocated for building socialist industrial unionism has led nowhere. The Socialist Labour Party today has all but disappeared. They were right about what type of organization could actually put the working class in charge. but they were ultimately unable to develop the tactics that led to the creation of a viable socialist industrial union movement. They squandered the political capital they had worked so hard to gather. The history of the last 100 years has proven this. We need to win the propaganda battle. Right-wing populism has weighed in heavily in recent decades, with innumerous straw-man arguments against socialism. Margaret Thatcher famously once said, "The problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money." Well, when you have a socialist movement organizing production on its own terms, without reference to the capitalist class, it exposes the foolishness of that type of cynical rhetoric.